farmers are blockading major roads across France in what's been dubbed as the Siege of Paris.
Yes, dramatic pictures. They're seeking to stop food deliveries to supermarkets as part of ongoing protests against falling incomes, increasing bureaucracy and, crucially, cheap imports.
So, how is the British farming industry affected by these same issues? And is net zero impoverishing farmers?
Well, OK, joining us now to debate this is dairy farmer Charles Goadby and the research director at the Adam Smith Institute, Maxwell Marlow. Charles, I'll start with you, as you are the dairy farmer. Do you empathise with what's going on in France? These farmers are absolutely furious. They think that the prices of their goods are essentially being undercut by supermarkets, by the likes of Aldi and Lidl.
Yes, I do empathise with them, and it just shows what a dire situation and the strength of feeling that's out there. Do I agree with the extreme lengths that they're going to? I don't think I do, no, but I can fully understand why they are doing what they are.
And Charles, do you think that the real concern here is this sort of hyper-capitalist importing of cheap food from overseas, but also from these cheap supermarkets that Emily mentioned? How hard does that make life for farmers?
I'll be honest, life is getting impossible. We've seen our input costs just spiral beyond control almost at times. And yet at the same time, we're being demanded to by the supermarkets and larger retailers that we've got to produce for less and less. And we're seeing attacks almost from both sides. So yes, we're seeing our produce being undercut by cheap imports. Now, some may argue that that's a good thing. We're keeping the price of food down. For me, it's not good at all, because we are producing under regulations that demand that we have the highest animal welfare standards, we have the highest environmental and sustainability standards in the world, and that comes at a cost to us to produce to those standards. So when we're seeing produce come in and undercut us that don't meet those standards, it really is a kick in the teeth.
Maxwell, is
at
it
the same time?
Maxwell, is it worth impoverishing farmers just to have cheaper food in our supermarkets?
Well, it's not really impoverishing farmers.
You've got to ask you.
Sorry, I'm just bringing in Maxwell here, Charles. Maxwell.
It's less about impoverishing farmers and more about providing a competitive deal for consumers. The great man himself, Adam Smith, who said, no, by means of glasses, hotbeds and hot walls, very good grapes can be raised in Scotland, but 9 times the price compared to France. We wouldn't suggest, growing coffee or wine or oranges here in the UK.
Well,
so
we have a lovely booming wine industry, Maxwell. Where have you been?
That is true, of course, in the south. But people still want to drink Merlot. They still want to drink Sauvignon Blanc, and a lot of the best stuff comes from abroad. Farmers need to be competing, and they're not at the moment. Yes, Charles is right about high standards, and those are expensive. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is a very uncompetitive industry at the teat of government, sucking up a lot of subsidy from the taxpayer. Whereas, consumers are paying the price, whether through their taxes or through, of course, higher food prices.
Well, hang on, Maxwell. We've been talking a lot about war, the prospect of an all-out war. Is it not vitally important that we have our own food supplies in this country and that we can be reasonably self-sufficient with something as important as food?
Of course it is, and nobody's arguing to abolish the farming industry, but they need to become more innovative. When you look at capital spending and productivity in the farming industry in the UK, it's some of the lowest in Europe, and we need to have a really serious conversation about that, especially following your previous segment about labour shortages in the farming industry. It's really important that we have a good, sustainable industry in the UK, but you can do that in line with a lot of the really good free trading agreements that we should be going for. During the Second World War, for example, we imported a lot of food from the US. We didn't starve, we did have rationing, but that was a long time ago. We need to be renewing those free trade agreements and trying to get more food on the plates for Britain, whilst also increasing our own sustainability.
Charles, what about that point that you shouldn't fear foreign competition? Perhaps it should spur a greater level of efficiency in British farm output, because British farms are less efficient than, for example, New Zealand farms or Australian farms.
Well, I disagree. I don't think they are less efficient. We have some of the most efficient farming in the world here. But we're being held back maybe to a certain degree by the rules and regulations that are being enforced upon us. I'd like to go back about, let's look at the food security we have in this country. In the 1980s, we were almost 80% self-sufficient in the food we produce. Today, that's fallen by around about 25%. And we only have to see what happened during COVID, during the start of the Ukraine conflict, what happened to our just-in-time supply chain. We were caught with our trousers down. We saw empty supermarket shelves. And, that just started a whole snowballing of, people queuing for food and not being able to get it. And that's what led to the hyperinflation back then. And we also have to ask the question is, what is cheap food? I would argue that food in this country is far too cheap. We are the third cheapest what we spend on food in relation to our average income in the world. So let's not blame
Charles,
food.
On that point, because a lot of people looking at their bills every month will want food to be as cheap as possible, but do you think that people, good British citizens, should give up the likes of Aldi and Lidl to help farmers?
No, not necessarily. But I think we need to, all of the supermarkets, they're all in competition with each other for getting footfall. And you only have to just look at the sort of profits that a lot of these larger retailers are making. And all we're asking really is for fairness in that supply chain. We don't want to see any one institution taking the cream off at the expense of other people and other industries.
Well, Charles,
so we have fair trade in bananas, in sugar, in coffee. Why do we not have fair trade in this country? Because if it's not fair trade, it's unfair trade.
Well, Charles, we started with you. We'll finish with Maxwell. Your response to those points.
I mean, we do have fair trade in this country. We have the whole point of fair trade is to remove slavery from from supply chains. I don't think we have much slavery in this country. And not to mention, the fair trade agreements that, were put in place are self-regulatory. So, the British farming industry is at most liberty to start its own fair trade agreements. Yes, we should have profitable supermarkets. We want supermarket buildings to be there. If we reference COVID, for example, the logistical supply chain rather than the farms were the ones in trouble because we had a once-in-a-century pandemic. We need to be really careful about how we talk about this. And, we didn't have hyperinflation. That was really down to the Bank of England rather than from cost-push inflation. So I think the farmers are wrong here. We need cheap imports for, to get food on tables and to nourish our people.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed for that great debate. Maxwell Marlow from the Adam Smith Institute and Charles Goadby, who is a dairy farmer himself. Where do you stand on that one? GBViews at gbnews.com.